Welcome to Sab's podcast. I'm your host, sabrinasalvati. My special guest today is Professor Mohammad Marandi. He is a professor at the University of Tehran. Welcome back, Professor Marandi.
Hi, Sabrina. Thank you very much for inviting me. It's always an honor.
So it has been a very interesting week. Recently, Israel announced that they assassinated Yemen's prime minister. I want to talk a little bit about that, considering that a lot of people just seem to be looking the other way as if it's okay to just assassinate a prime minister. So I want to talk a little bit about that. And now it appears that the Houthis have issued a response that they will retaliate. I think Al Jazeera just reported a couple of hours ago that they are launching attacks they launched an attack towards an Israeli facility. So I want to get into that a little bit, how Israel can just walk away assassinating a prime minister, and of course, no pushback here from the West.
Oh, absolutely. It's quite stunning. The Israelis literally carry out airstrikes on Lebanon on a daily basis. And almost every day they kill someone. But you don't hear about that in the news. Even though Western news agencies have offices in Beirut, they have journalists there, they have fixers, they have drivers, there are many local people. So almost every day someone is getting killed in Lebanon, but it's normal apparently. It's okay. So it's not reported. And then you have regular bombings in Syria, even though the Jolani regime, the Sharat regime, is pathetic and it's trying its best to be on good terms with the Israeli regime. It's killing the minorities and abusing and slaughtering Syrian citizens, but it wants to be friends with Netanyahu. But despite that, they still bomb Syria and occupy new territory there. That's not in the news. And so when they bomb Yemen, and of course there's the West Bank, where we don't hear about the huge amounts of crimes that are taking place there, the rapid increase in the pace of ethnic cleansing and dispossession across the West Bank. We don't hear about that either, even though Western embassies and Western journalists are all over Palestine, occupied Palestine. So I'm not surprised that the prime minister of Yemen is murdered along with a number of cabinet members. All of these cabinet members are people who deal with civil society, ministries that have to do with education, that have to do with the welfare of ordinary people. They were murdered. They didn't murder a military council or anything like that. And that, of course, fits within the pattern of Israeli attacks in Yemen, where they constantly strike civilian facilities and civilian targets, just like the Americans did. So I'm not surprised, but in a sane world, in a world where the West is truly the free world or the civilized world, each and every one of these examples should be together, on the front page. The front page of the New York Times should have a piece on Lebanon, a piece on Syria, a piece on the West Bank, and a piece on Gaza, of course, and on the murder of the Yemeni prime minister. But no, it's not important because we all now know that the Western media is controlled, it is owned. We know that Western governments are owned and controlled. And so it's up to people like yourself, myself, and others to raise awareness that these people are resisting the Holocaust. Because at the end of the day, the prime minister of Yemen was murdered because Yemen is standing up against this genocide. They are implementing the genocide convention, blocking the Red Sea to Israeli regime shipping because of the genocide in Gaza. They've said that once the genocide stops, they'll stop the blockade. So this is all about protecting ordinary women and children, and for that they get murdered. And it's interesting that in the United States and the Europeans, they like to keep saying the Houthis. But this is the prime minister was not a Houthi. He wasn't even from northern Yemen. He's from southern Yemen, probably Aden, but in any case, he's from southern Yemen. And this shows that this is a national government. This is a government where people across Yemen are standing together, protecting the country, but also in this case, and more importantly in this case, they are united in the defense of the Palestinian people, and they shed blood and they give martyrs in order to protect Palestinian women and children.
Essentially, it would be the same if someone tried to, or if someone assassinated the president of the United States. Like it's the fact that the West or the Western media is cheering this on. I just want people to understand the significant impact of this. And what does this mean for Ansar Allah? Because the reality is, I have been pretty fortunate to talk to people that have been to Gaza or been in Gaza, particularly also after October 7th. I have interviewed people on this show that have been to the West Bank, even after October 7th. But we are not fortunate to speak to people who are in Yemen. I feel like they are very voiceless in Western media and even in independent media. It is difficult, I think, to be able to reach out to someone there and to get them on. But what does this mean for Ansar Allah?
Well, maybe I can put you in contact with some people for the future. Maybe you can interview some people. I was invited a while back with Pepe Escobar and some other friends, but unfortunately, I couldn't go to Yemen because I would have to fly through Jordan, and the Jordanese government will not give me a visa because I would apparently need a visa in Jordan to go to Yemen. It's not as if I would be able to go without getting that visa. So, but they went, and I perhaps they can give me some I mean, I have friends in Yemen, and they too have their own contacts. Maybe I can give you a few so that you could speak to a couple of people there. But it is very the scenes in Yemen have been very um, impressive. How the people came to the streets for the funeral. And by the way, every week in Sana'a, the capital of Yemen, you have these huge protests in support of the Palestinian people. But the funeral for the prime minister and the ministers who were murdered and martyred by the Israeli regime, the crowds were huge. And again, the prime minister is from the south. He is Sunni, and he is a martyr for Palestine. The unity among the people of Yemen is and their sympathy for the Palestinian people is extraordinary. And you know, Sabrina, the Ansar Allah or the Houthis or the people of Yemen have been demonized for many years. The Saudis and the Emiratis, they carried out a genocide there, backed by the West for 7 years. Day and night they were bombing Yemen, and they imposed a starvation siege. In the Red Sea, U.S. naval ships would stop small boats that had medicine and food, and they just dump it into the sea, just to starve the people in Yemen, along with the Saudis, all of them collaborating together. They did that for 7 years. And everyone supported them. During the first couple of years, Qatar and Al Jazeera and Turkey, they too supported them. They supported the Saudis. And then they split after there was a fallout. After Qatar and the Emirates and the Saudis, they had those deep divisions. Then Qatar shifted its position, and Al Jazeera shifted its position, and so did Turkey. So you had this huge consensus across the region and in the Western world to crush the people of Yemen for 7 years. And the Arabic media day and night was demonizing them. And so these people who were demonized and being crushed under the starvation siege and airstrikes and attacks day and night, and there was a huge army of mercenaries funded by the Saudis and the Emiratis. These people are the ones who are playing a historic role and the most heroic role alongside Hezbollah, who also sacrificed immensely for the people of Gaza. They're playing this historic and heroic role for the people of Gaza. And now they are recognized as heroes across the region and beyond. So they were demonized for so many years. But now those people who tried to demonize them, they're the ones who are frowned upon because they've done nothing for the people of Gaza. They've all been doing business and trade. Many of them have uh, embassies. Many of them are sending oil to or transporting oil to Israel. Many of them are selling other goods and services and purchasing goods and services. The same countries that were demonizing Ansar Allah or Yemen. And now their people look down upon them, and people look at Ansar Allah as the heroes. So the truth comes out ultimately. The truth comes out, and the people of Yemen, they are the great heroes of our time.
It's really interesting. I believe it was about maybe a year and a half ago. There was a resolution that was being or supposed to be brought forward on the Senate floor to stop the starvation and the ongoing arm weapon shipment to Saudi Arabia. That was proposed by Bernie Sanders. Ultimately, Biden stepped in there and said, don't bring it to the floor for a vote. It's not going to pass. But he referred to it as a humanitarian crisis at that point in time. The U.S. is directly responsible for the humanitarian crisis in Yemen because we're the ones that gave those weapons to Saudi Arabia to carry out that attack. I did not know that Al Jazeera backed Saudi Arabia during that time. That is rather disappointing.
Oh yes, Al Jazeera. I was on a couple of shows in Al Jazeera at the beginning of that criminal war, and I was a lone voice. And then Al Jazeera stopped inviting me for a very long time. Just like over Syria in 2012 or so, Al Jazeera. I'm not quite sure what year it was, maybe 13, I don't know, but I was regularly on Al Jazeera almost from the very beginning when it was Al Jazeera English, when it was created, and I was a regular guest. And then I don't know exactly when it was, but during the Syrian dirty war, when Qatar and the NATO and all of them were funding ISIS and Al Qaeda, suddenly every time I get invited on Al Jazeera, they'd say, "Can you come like for the 4 o'clock news?" And I'd say, "Sure." And back then we'd had to go to the studio. There wasn't like now where you just go on Zoom or Skype or whatever there is today. So I'd go, and then halfway there, when I'm on my way, like I'm driving from across town, across the city, they'd call me and say, "Oh, it's been canceled," or "We have a different topic." And that happened like 3 or 4 times in a row. And then once, I actually remember what happened. Then once I was sitting on campus, eating lunch with colleagues, and before lunch, they called me to be on a show called Inside Story. And I said, sure. And then during lunch, they called me again and canceled, said there's been a change in topic. This was about Syria. I said, okay. And then they called the person next to me, or at the table. I don't know if I don't remember exactly if he was sitting next to me, and asked him to come on the show on the same topic. And then after that, I sent an email to all my contacts on Al Jazeera saying, why are you doing this? And one of them contacted me in private and said, look, they've told us not to invite you anymore because of your position on Syria. But since they're different producers, not all of them, they know, so they may invite you, and then they're told to disinvite you. And that's why this happens. So yeah, there have been on 3 different occasions that I've just a few months ago, after the fall of Syria to ISIS and Al Qaeda and these criminals, I was on Inside Story for the show, and they pulled the show before it was shown. They didn't show it that day. Someone from the boss said, no, we're not going to show that recorded program, that half-an-hour program. So yeah, Al Jazeera, there's some good people in Qatar, especially before 2011 and 12. Al Jazeera was very good. But been very different. There's still good people there, but Al Jazeera is, it's not going to do anything that runs against American interests. They may show, sympathy. They may be allowed to show sympathy for Gaza, but they're not going to show, they're not going to support Ansar Allah. After all, Doha was used by the Americans to help carry out their strikes on Yemen, and they don't sympathize with the resistance or the axis of resistance.
Interesting. You find out new things. You find out new things. I want to pivot for just a second to this report that came through about Iran. A lot of people are talking about this. Iran says it will use more advanced missiles if Israel attacks again. Iran on Wednesday said that if Israel launched fresh attacks, it will respond with newly developed missiles that have far greater capabilities than the ones that were used by Tehran during its 12-day war with Israel in June. I want to talk a little bit about that. There was an interview recently, I want to say, with someone from the Trump administration. I forget if it was J.D. Vance or just one of those warmongers. And they were saying that we could expect a war with Israel and Iran by December of this year. And I want to get your thoughts on that. Obviously, that would be coming from the West. So they're already sending the alarm out there to people that the West fully backs Israel restarting a war with Iran. So I'm putting that out there now, just in case people forget or people just, I don't know, don't understand where this all began. So they are already setting the stage for that. And now the reports are coming out that Iran has new missiles. What are those, if that is true, what are those new missiles and what are those capabilities?
Well, Sabrina, the West, I mean, you're too young to remember, but I'm sure you've read about it. When Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, the same Saddam Hussein that was the ally of the West, they gave him chemical weapons to use against his own people. And then in the name of chemical weapons, they destroyed the country. But when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, and you and your audience may know that he actually spoke to the U.S. ambassador before the attack, and she spoke to him in a way in which sort of seemed to be that she was giving a green light. And a lot of people think that the Americans were actually encouraging him to attack Kuwait. But that aside, when he attacked Kuwait, we saw how he was demonized. And for the first time, the U.S. president spoke about, and CNN, back then CNN was a big thing. It was, satellite TV had just begun that this new era, just like the internet later on became a thing. CNN was talking about how Saddam was how he had gassed his own people and Iranians. They weren't saying that, or, Western media wasn't saying that when it was actually happening, when he was actually gassing Iranians during the war and gassing his own people. Only after Kuwait did that become an issue. And then the U.S. President Bush the senior, he would speak about chemical weapons and all that. But also, if you recall, the Kuwaiti ambassadors, the daughter of the Kuwaiti ambassador to Washington, we didn't know she was the daughter of the ambassador, but she came and gave this testimony that they took these kids, they threw these kids out of incubators in hospitals and took the incubators. I don't know if you recall that. So that was used to gather support in the public to attack Iraq. But the Israelis actually, and it was a lie. That did not happen. I mean, I hate Saddam Hussein. I hate his regime. But the war was illegitimate, and they did not do that. They didn't commit that particular crime. But the Israelis did commit that crime. They did pull the plug of those incubators in a hospital in Gaza, so that the infants would die. And the Western media and Western government support them. So why wouldn't they support war against Iran? Why wouldn't they support the murder of Yemeni citizens and the Yemeni prime minister and government? Why wouldn't they support the slaughter of the people of Lebanon for the sake of Israel? They support any crime that is committed. by this genocidal regime. But yes, there is a possibility that there will be war. I don't know if it's for certain. I don't know if it'll happen. If it does happen, that it'll happen soon or later. I can't say, but the assumption in Tehran is that there will be war. In other words, they're preparing for war. They don't. No one knows if there ever will be a war. If the Israeli regime was sane, they wouldn't launch a war because they won't win. But Netanyahu is fighting for his own survival, his own political survival. He's fighting to stay out of jail. So a lot of what we're seeing over the last 2 years are not at all in the interest of the Israeli regime. The Israeli regime is despised across the world right now. That, I think, is the biggest defeat possible. When the world hates you, I don't think it can get much worse than that. But he's doing it because he wants to stay out of prison, and his allies, who are the most fanatical of the Zionists, they don't care about what people think they're doing. So the Iranians are assuming they're preparing for war, and as we all know, it was Iran's missiles that defeated Israel. And why do I say Israel, the regime, was defeated? Because people like C. Bannon said, I've heard it twice from him, that during the last 3 days, things were really bad for the Israelis. The Iranian missiles were hitting hard, and they were no longer able to stop them. And Trump saved the regime. Trump saved Netanyahu. And Trump, too, alluded to this, how Iran was hammering the regime, the Netanyahu regime. So, and we saw that during the last few days of the war, the last 3 or 4 days, almost all of Iran's missiles were getting through. And the Israelis were beginning, and the Americans were running out of ammunition, surface-to-air missiles. But even with ammunition that they were using, they were failing to stop the missiles during the last few days, especially. This time around, the Iranians are going to hit much harder. And they're going to use missiles that they hadn't used before, plus newer missiles, and more with a bigger payload, much bigger payload. And one of the really good missiles that the Iranians have, the Khaybar missile, that is going to be used much more extensively. So it would be a major miscalculation on behalf of the Israeli regime if they launched a war. But, a friend of mine just last night, interestingly, told me that he met a colleague of his in the United States who was a Zionist and who had been to Israel after the war. And he said the damage in Tel Aviv was huge and that many areas were affected because the Iranian missiles have heavy payloads, but also they're hypersonic and they come in at a, very fast. The damage was extraordinary. So I don't know if it's going to happen, but Iranian missile and drone capabilities are greater than before. And also the Iranians have been restructuring many things since the war, intelligence gathering and internal security, better protecting their assets better than before in case there's a war. The Israelis gave it the Israeli regime gave it everything it had because this was a war to sort of bring about regime change, as they like to call it. And the West was behind them. The International Atomic Energy Agency lied about Iran's nuclear program to justify the war. They didn't condemn the bombing of civilian nuclear targets. The Europeans supported the war. They said Israel has the right to defend itself. They launched a blitzkrieg attack without provocation, but the Europeans were saying Israel has the right to defend itself. And of course, Trump was gloating about his role in all this. So Iran was caught off guard to a degree. They knew an attack was coming, but they didn't think that they were going for so-called regime change. So this time around, the Iranians are going to, they've captured and arrested many of these people who are carrying out sabotage. These networks that the regime had created in Iran and the West, because what these intelligence agencies and regional intelligence agencies work together. So they took them out. And as I said, Iran defense capabilities are being reorganized and restructured. So this time around, it's going to be a lot worse for the for the regime, but it's Netanyahu, and Netanyahu is a genocidal monster that wants to preserve his rule. So nothing can be ruled out.
What what is the damage that those missiles could do? Like, for example, we did see the damage that was done by the missiles earlier on, but these new missiles, like for example, are they powerful enough to damage Tel Aviv, for example?
Well, the missiles that were fired into Tel Aviv did huge damage across the city. And as I said, the payload is there are different types of missiles, and obviously they have different purposes. Some have bigger payloads, some have warheads that split into uh, smaller warheads, and they destroy a larger area. Some are very precise, so if you have a target that you need to be, have a hit it precisely, you use those missiles. And also these missiles, which have the power to maneuver and so on, since there's different types, it's much more difficult for air defenses to deal with them. These newer missiles, I don't know anything about it. The Iranians have a new policy of not saying much about their military achievements nowadays. They say that we in the past we were boasting too much. That's basically what the military was saying. That we, meaning the military, we boasted too much about our capabilities, and so for now on, we're going to give less information about our achievements. But they have said that they have a newer missile, and my understanding is that it has a very, very heavy payload. So the damage that each of those missiles will bring about is greater than, significantly greater than the missiles that have been used in the past.
Yeah, the reason why I ask is because this goes to show that once again, Israel is willing to put their own people at risk in order to achieve this greater Israel plan. Like they're willing to. Same thing with the hostages in Gaza, for example. Many of us said this early on. It wasn't really about those hostages, that they didn't really care to get them out. And they had many chances, many opportunities to negotiate to get those hostages out. And it was never really about that. But they are willing to risk the lives of the Israeli people in order to accomplish this greater Israel plan to go to war with Iran. They know that Iran is powerful. They know that Iran is huge. And this is something I was trying to explain like to my audience that the West, I know we're talked about a lot, but the West is very small when you compare us to the rest of the world. And I was showing my audience, like, look at how large Iran is. Like it's just like Israel knows these things. So what they try to do is they try to get that support from other countries in the West to be able to continue their genocidal project, right? And that has worked out so far until recently. There are a number of countries that have started to push back in different ways, not to the full extent that I would like them to. But New Zealand, or I believe it was New Zealand, decided that they were going to divest from Israeli like companies, etc. There's a number of things that have been done. I think the UK is now finally trying to grow some type of a backbone to say that they're going to withhold at least some weapons or whatever. But the reality is Israel knows that this is not something that they could do on their own, but they're still willing to sacrifice their own people in order to continue this colonial expansion.
Well, we have to remember that, and I know your audience knows because they're very politically aware, but on October the 7th, the Israelis murdered hundreds of their own citizens so that they wouldn't be taken. And most of these people were, or at least a huge segment of them, were active soldiers. They were in uniform when they were taken. And Israel boasts that men and women, all men and women, adult men and women, they serve in the army, so they're reservists. So it's not as if they were just taking these women, and men who are carrying dandelions and walking down the streets. They were basically partying. Those who were, in civilian clothes, they were partying alongside the apartheid wall. And so when these groups, and if I recall correctly, the resistance and Hamas didn't even know that that there was going to be a party then on the day of the operation. So when they went and took these people, the Israelis just bombed them. because that's a part of their doctrine to prevent anyone from taking hostages, even though, as I said, many of these people, I saw a tweet just a few days ago. This Israeli was saying, this friend of mine, he put a picture of him. He was taken hostage from his tank. So he was taken from the tank, and he's still called a hostage. But the thousands of Palestinians, which include women and children, in Israeli regime jails, and many of them have never been put on trial, they're not hostages. And many of them most of them are from, almost all of them are from the occupied West Bank or Gaza. So it's not as if, according to international law, the Israeli regime shouldn't even be there. But these are not hostages in the Western media. These are prisoners, and the Israelis are hostages. But yes, as you rightly pointed out, they murdered their own people. They allowed their own people to starve. They bombed their own people during the last 2 years because that's not their priority. Their priority, in the case of Netanyahu, is to remain in power. And in the case of his allies, it's this, they have this fanatical worldview of a greater Israel, which includes parts of Saudi Arabia, big parts of Saudi Arabia, all of Jordan, parts of Iraq, even bits and pieces of Turkey, a part of Turkey, and Syria, as well as Lebanon. But all of these countries are so pathetic, and their governments, meaning people, but they're so pathetic that they still don't do anything about it. Egypt, which has a huge army, nothing. Turkey, they continue to transport oil from the Republic of Azerbaijan, cheap oil, to help fuel Netanyahu's army. So the Israeli regime is hell bent on slaughter and death and destruction, and they don't even care about their own prisoners. For them, for the regime, it's not important. And this is something I know you've covered before, and your guests have covered. But we have to keep in mind that when I speak about Netanyahu and his fanatical allies, it's not just them. Overwhelmingly, or at least a very strong majority of Israelis, they support the genocide. This is not like some thuggish group that are in control and that the country is taken hostage. No, even Netanyahu's opponents, they support the genocide. And a very strong majority supports the genocide. So these people they're colonizers. They consider themselves to be human and others to be subhuman. Amalek. And Sabrina, when the South Africans brought and I'm sorry for digressing, but when they brought their complaint to the ICJ like 100 years ago, it was like almost 2 years ago now, they showed in their presentation that there was genocidal intent. The prime minister of the regime, the president, the minister of defense, or the minister of genocide, and all these other peoples were saying there are no innocents. They were saying they were going to cut off all food and water. And it was clear as day that these are Amalek, and the Amalek in biblical terms basically means they have to be completely wiped out. So they showed there was genocidal intent. The ICJ then, well over a year and a half ago, said that this is quite possibly a genocide. It's been like 19, 20, 21 months since then. And still Western media tries to say, they try to hide the reality from their audiences. So the regime has complete disregard for its prisoners held by the resistance and Hamas in particular. And of course, they don't care at all about Palestinian women and children. You saw that person who was a green beret,
Yes.
and he said that how they would just gun down people, or they would. I think he said that like on one day, or the doctors and the physicians and the international workers in the hospitals, they would say like one day we would have children with wounds in the head, and it was clear that day the soldiers were shooting at the heads of the children. Then another day they would be shooting them in other sensitive parts, and then in the stomach, and so on. It was like a game. It's always been a game. And he, by the way, also said that, and again, I digress even further, that in Yemen, that American ships would stop boats that were taking medicine and food to Yemen and just dump it into the sea. So this is the world that we live in.
It's just it's absolutely insane. They just killed all those journalists in Gaza. And this is something else I've noticed too, Professor Morandi. It's interesting to me that now all of a sudden CNN, MSNBC, Fox News, now all of a sudden they are covering these things. Now we have watched journalists killed in Gaza at the start of this, like at the beginning under the Biden administration. And that is not the only times that journalists have been killed in Gaza, but they weren't talking about it then. And now it seems as though, I don't know if it's because we're under a Trump administration now, but I've noticed that now corporate media is talking about those things. Now they're discussing, look at all these journalists that were killed in Gaza as if this is the first time it has happened. What do you think is going on there? Why are they more willing to talk about the atrocities, the famine, the starvation in Gaza, and the civilian deaths?
I don't know if it has anything to do with Trump or not. That's something that I'd have to think about. But I think what is clear is that, and you were sort of alluding to this in the previous question, that this has nothing to do with these Western leaders getting a backbone. It is because of public pressure. I mean, when you look at the protests, for example, the protests in Australia, they were extraordinary. And it just shows, and Australians should be very proud of how they've taken a stance, and huge numbers in Sydney and elsewhere. But it's the pressure that's building that would make New Zealand or Australia or Canada or the French or the British and others or Norway for them to change their stance. I don't believe at all that any of these leaders, or at least almost any of them, willingly are shifting policy. They feel that they have to. The recognition of Palestine is really worthless because it's just a piece of paper. It's not going to change anything. But some of these countries are talking about recognizing Palestine because they want to ease the pressure from the public in their own countries that's directed against them. So this awakening that we're seeing across the world and across the West among ordinary people is extraordinary. And it shows how human beings from different religions and races, they're on, it shows that when they get information, they're decent people. People are mostly decent. That's why when they hear the truth, despite the censorship from Western media, despite the censorship from social media and the suppression of information, when they do finally get the information, they protest, or they show their displeasure to say, at least they show their displeasure. And that's why these people are making noise. They haven't done anything. They haven't sanctioned the Israeli regime. They continue to fund it. They continue to provide it arms to slaughter women and children. They're fine with that if they could get away with it. So I think that's basically it. They're under public pressure, and that is what is forcing them to make noise. Now, whether and I think this has been increasing over the last 2 years over time, but I think and I'm just guessing, I mean, not guessing, I have some anecdotal evidence for this, but it may not be accurate. I think ever since we saw the images of starving people, that there was a faster shift in the public mood in many parts of the world. And it was then when we began to see Western media and politicians to begin to make more noise. But still, Sabrina, you alluded to I think the reporters in that double tap, and now we know it's not just it wasn't a double tap, it was a triple tap attack, and there's even information that there were 4 projectiles that struck the hospital. But in any case, in that attack, the Reuters journalists a woman. And the West, apparently, when it comes to Palestinians, doesn't give a damn about women. Sorry for using that word. But uh, they didn't even, sorry, it was the Associated Press. They didn't even use, I think it was the Associated, they didn't even give her name. They didn't even say, she has a name. Or Reuters, when the Israeli regime lied and said that they took out a Hamas camera. I mean, it was in the hospital. It was in a place where all these journalists go to and everyone can see. But beyond that, this was a Reuters reporter and a Reuters camera. That camera was providing live feed for Reuters. Yet when Reuters reported this, they gave the Israeli narrative. Basically, they were condemning themselves, even though they knew it was a lie. So even though there is some change, it just shows how disgusting Western media is. When Chomsky wrote Manufactured Consent uh, uh, many years ago, I read the book decades ago, a long time ago. That book is outdated. It's even, I mean, back then, I think Western media compared to what it is today was infinitely better, even though it was pretty terrible back then too. But now it's just horrible when Reuters and all these others are behaving in this way. It's quite stunning. But people are waking up, and the young people in particular, and that is something that I believe is irreversible.
So there was a new poll that was just released, and speaking of the young people, that the majority of Gen Z in the United States support Hamas. This
Yeah.
is this is where the changes are coming from, and I know that I'm pretty sure the U.S. government is very unhappy with that poll, but this is just the reality. I mean, like people are waking up, and this is connected to something else too. I'm not sure if you saw this, Professor Marandi. Did you hear about the story about the influencers? It was just outed that influencers were taking dark money to push. Okay, so you know, okay. Okay, because I'm
Yeah,
making
and you know what? It's very misleading nowadays for us when we say alternative media. It has this positive connotation, of course. It's like just like yourself. You have influence, you have an audience, and you have an impact on young people, I'm sure in particular. But so we call you alternative media, and so it has this positive connotation, and that's pretty dangerous because a lot of that alternative media is actually funded just like mainstream media, and this sort of thing is coming out. So the real alternative media is people like yourselves and Katie and Max and Electronic Intifada and all those other great people out there who are doing great work. But on the left and right in the United States, even though there's not really an established mainstream in the mainstream, they're not left and right. They're the uniparty. There's a lot of money out there going to their alternative, so-called alternative media.
right. And one of the things that was revealed in the expose is that these influencers not only were not supposed to tell people that they were being paid to paint a certain narrative, but one of the things they weren't supposed to talk about was Gaza. They weren't
Yeah.
supposed to talk about pro-Palestinian, et cetera. And if you look at their content, and this is what I was telling people, if you look at David Pakman's channel, you look at Brian Tyler Cohen's channel, it's just all Trump, 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 Trump. And yeah, Trump is bad, but the fact that they're not even talking about an ongoing genocide was very telling. And when they did at the very beginning of the war, they're pro-Israel. David Pakman was definitely pro-Israel, said, well, this is all because of Hamas. And you add that to that poll that was just released that the majority of Gen Z support Hamas. The Democratic Party, and I'm sure the GOP is doing this too, but more people tend to be surprised because the Democrats are doing it. The Democratic Party is colluding with YouTube media, which a lot of people in YouTube media say that they're independent, but they're not all independent. They are colluding with them to basically try to win back that young voter base and bring them back into the Democratic Party because they lost the youth vote in 2024. And in doing so, that means that they are going to be complicit and accepting of a genocide of an entire group of people. And I don't think a lot of people really understand the magnitude of this decision of those influencers that you were willing to either support the genocide or be silent about a genocide in order to get a check on top of the checks that you already get. So the media, like the parties in particular, they are doing everything that they can to try to establish a pro-Israel narrative.
So if someone says that these people are no better than the Nazis, and or even worse, because many back then when you had Nazi Germany, how many people even knew that they were like people dying in concentration camps? And there was no internet back then. There was no, so but now no one can hide it. It's happening right in front of us day and night. Yet these people continue to support it. So after the Nazis were overthrown, a lot of these Germans, whether true or false, whether they were lying or not, that's a different thing. Well, they were saying, we didn't know. But who can say they don't know now? And so are these people any better than the Nazis, if not worse? Because we know that they know. We know that they know. We know that they know what's happening in Gaza. And we know that everyone knows that the real death figures are not 60, 70,000. There are thousands, tens of thousands perhaps, under the rubble. There are hundreds of thousands who either die of like all. How many cancer patients do you have in the United States? I mean, any one of your viewers right now can use DeepSeek or whatever to see the numbers. In Gaza, all those cancer patients will die. There's no medicine. So in the United States, thanks to the new technology and so on, many cancer patients live a long life that allows their children to grow up, and many of them are cured. In Palestine, they're all condemned to death. But none of these deaths are going to be counted, or other diseases. So imagine or people, for example, who are wounded, and then 6 months later they die of some infection or whatever. They're not going to be counted as. So you may have there are probably hundreds of thousands of people who died in Gaza. This is truly a Holocaust taking place in front of us. These people are more evil than the average Nazi, let's say. The Nazis at the death camps and so on, they, of course, are like Netanyahu and the people around him. But these people are more guilty than someone working in Nazi Germany in far away from these death camps, who probably didn't know or may not have known the extent of the crimes being committed. These people are fully guilty. They see it every day. They see it day and night. They are as evil, at least, as the Nazis. I was on this, I don't want to name it, but I was on a show just recently, very recently, and I told the person that there's no moral equivalent. He was saying there are two sides to the story. And I said, it's like, I didn't give this example, but it's like the rapist and the victim, and say, well, there are two sides to the story. No, and so I have to give him like half an hour on my show, and then her another half an hour to be fair. No, that's you can't do that. He shouldn't have any voice. But in reality, he's the one who gets the voice in Western media. The murderer, the rapist, and the victim, she doesn't even exist. And maybe every now and then a victim or two will be shown for a few minutes, and then to show, this token victim to say that, look, we're balanced. But no, there are no two sides. There's the victim and the murderer. So remember October the 7th, how for months Western media was talking about the rapes. Well, it turns out there was no evidence for them. I remember when I first went on Piers Morgan's show, and he was saying, I said, well, where's the evidence? And he was like, he didn't know what to say. Show us the evidence. There was no evidence of beheadings. There was no evidence of kids getting cooked in I don't know, all that disgusting stuff. All that was just nonsense to prepare the grounds for the genocide. But what do we have instead? We have footage of people being raped in prison. We have footage of kids being beheaded, all the time. all the time. So these people, they are, they're guilty as hell. And this is unforgivable. And, Sabrina, that God aside, I believe in God, and all of us are going to, that everything will be dealt with when the time comes. But all that aside, these people, their grandchildren, in the day and age where we have AI and things are changing, their grandchildren are going to see all the things that they've said online, and they're going to see the reality of what happened in Gaza, and they'll know that their parents or their grandparents were criminals. They'll know. They won't be able to escape. It'll be worse than Nazi Germany, far worse, because in Nazi Germany, you don't have that sort of evidence. You have a few pictures, black and white pictures, and then you have these museums. But in today's world, you have your cell phone. Every now and then I have to delete all the clips that I have of the killings and because my cell phone doesn't have space, I just delete it so to free space on my cell phone. That's how extensive it is. It's truly dystopian. However, I'm not a pessimist. And when I look at the protests that are taking place across the world, when I see like the work that you and many others do, and you see these young men and women, young Jews in particular, some of them are mutual friends, being courageous, sacrificing. When you see the people of Yemen or Hezbollah and others, all people across the world, as I said, different races, different religions, different classes, working class, middle class, upper middle class, whatever. When you see all these people taking a stand despite the censorship, that is very encouraging. These are very dark times, but I think we have to keep that in mind because there is light at the end of the tunnel.
That's right. And I would say at this point, Israel is becoming very desperate. We can see that with these attempts from Benjamin Netanyahu doing these podcast tours. And I sounded the alarm when I saw him on the PBD podcast speaking to Patrick Bet-David, who, of course, gave him no pushback. A very softball interview. Of course, he got ratioed for that. A lot of the viewers were not happy with the way that Patrick Bet-David handled that interview. I don't know if in Iran, so like in the US, we kind of have a term for people who just kind of, sell, like we call them sellouts. Like you guys are a sellout. You're willing to sell out like your own community, your own people, to achieve some type of fame, wealth, status, etc. Is there a term like in Iran, is there a term for people who do that? Like people are looking at Patrick Bet-David and they're just like, this dude is totally like, dude, like, what are you doing? Netanyahu came onto his show and referred to Middle Eastern people as barbarians. And he sat right there and gave no pushback, no pushback at all. So I think there's a reason why Netanyahu's trying to do this podcast tour to try to garner more support for Israel, but it just shows how desperate Israel is being. But I'm curious about that. Is there a term like in Iran, is there a term for people who just kind of like sell out and just go with the establishment?
Yeah, we have terms for that sort of thing, some more polite, some less polite. So, and like for example, after the war that the Americans and the Israelis carried out against Iran, some people who were saying we have to to negotiate with Trump, and in sort of in a way implying that we should forget the past. People were outraged at them, and there were more polite ways to say it and less polite ways to say it. But what I think is most important, again, it goes back to what I was saying earlier, is that pushback is, of course, absolutely necessary. But in the case of like like Hitler or Netanyahu or some other monster like that, they shouldn't have a platform. If we had this sort of technology during the Second World War, would it be acceptable to have like Hitler on a podcast and say, well, he has a point of view. I'll give I'll make sure there's pushback. No, you don't give these people a platform. They should be shut down completely. But it's interesting that not only do they get a platform, but there is no pushback, and it's their voices that are amplified. Those who are opposing the genocide and supporting the victims, their voices are being heard despite mainstream media, despite social media and their algorithms and their censorship and their suppression, despite all that. So again, if there's no hope in that sort of alternative media, they should be ignored. There's no hope in the mainstream media, but there's a lot of hope in ordinary people, and there's a lot of hope. A lot of hope should be put in, and we should invest in those people who are courageously standing up. I gave this example many times. I don't. It's just something that I recall. Early on, when the genocide began, I remember a picture online of some woman standing in front of the Israeli regime embassy in Seoul, in Korea, South Korea, and it was said that every day she goes there and stands up and protests. Well, back then she was a lone person, but now wherever when you look online, you see people across the world they've turned against this regime. So these people, these suppressed voices, they've now become by far the majority. And I would guess, Sabrina, and I'm just saying this based on zero evidence whatsoever, I would guess that even those polls, they're probably biased in favor of the Israeli regime. Because just like during the U.S. elections, Trump is always losing, and according to most of the polls, and then like in 2024 and 2016, he won despite the polls being against him. I would imagine that in the case of Israel, the polls would be even more biased. So, despite that, but even if they aren't biased, the shift is clear as day. But I would imagine that the shift is even probably greater.
Yeah, and speaking of that, people trying to do something differently. There is a new freedom flotilla that just departed from Barcelona to Gaza. For those who are not aware, there are going to be 50 ships that are heading that way. I just want to make sure I show it here. Yes, Greta Thunberg is one of the ones that is aboard. She's coming back again. I also understand actress Susan Sarandon may also be a part of this as well. I just want to show people those ships departing here.
Will be detained, and then they can be deported. But there are so many more of them this time. Last time, when Greta Thunberg was going in June, there were around 12 people that were detained. Now we've got 20 boats going from here. The others that will meet them on the Mediterranean. So it is a much bigger challenge that they're putting out there. But certainly, they're saying they need to do this because of the famine that we're seeing in Gaza, because of what they say is a man-made starvation. Of course, that's disputed by the Israelis.
And she does break up a little bit there, I think, because of the streaming efforts. But Professor Marandi, this is, we remember that first Freedom Flotilla after October 7th, and then there was the other one here more recently with Chris Smalls, who was detained and beaten and brutalized in Israel. And now we see again, that
and
did
he
not
was the
stop.
only. He was the only. I think he's African American, right? I think he's.
Yeah, he was the only one.
Yeah. So yeah, the others were not tortured or beaten or brutalized like he was.
Correct. And but we see that did not stop this
No.
mission. Now there are over 50 ships that are headed towards that way. Greta Thunberg is back again. And they did reveal, I believe that Susan Sarandon is one of the people that I believe also may be aboard one of those ships. Again, someone who's an actress doesn't have to do this if they don't want to. They could just sit back and enjoy this Hollywood life, but they choose to get involved. And she has protested against a number of issues prior to this as well. I think this says a lot, Professor Marandi. Now, obviously, Israel has already issued a response, and they said this time around, Greta Thunberg, they will be detained and treated inhumanely. But it's 50 ships, and I think it really does send a message that yes, we know you did what you did to Chris Smalls, but that is not going to stop us from trying to do what we're doing here. And I was actually surprised that Sky News covered this.
Well, Sabrina, I think the most interesting thing about the clip that you showed was that these people did not look like the Axis of Resistance. They didn't look like Hezbollah in Lebanon. They didn't look like the Iranians or Ansar Allah in Yemen. These were ordinary people in Europe. So there are two Europes. There are two Americas. One is this uncivilized elite that has been carrying out war and genocide for centuries, and they've been against their own people, as we increasingly see nowadays. How their own people are being impoverished and the wealth is being accumulated by fewer and fewer people. And then you see the ordinary, decent people who, when they see the truth, they take a stand. They take a stance. And that, I think, is something that is very encouraging. Those people did not look like Hezbollah. They did not look like Ansar Allah, but they were there. And I'm sure some of them are under some sort of threat. They could lose their job, or they could be harassed, or they could, because we've seen it happen already across Europe and North America. But still, people take a stand. And that, I think, is that's heroic of all of them. And again, it's encouraging because it shows that this is not like this is not about, we see so many Jews. I'm not saying the majority of Jews, but a huge segment of Jews. I don't know the numbers, but a huge segment of Jews are standing up against this. A huge segment of Europeans, white Europeans, North Americans are standing up against this. Hindus, I think I've said this a couple of times. I'm not quite sure, and I apologize to her because I've said this three or four times. At MIT, that young lady who gave her that speech, I think she was Hindu, and I think she was also punished. So you see people from different religions, different races, from different parts of the world, from different classes, all taking a stance, despite the suppression of information, despite the censorship. And that, as I said, I think that's the most encouraging thing about all of this, that people are, I'm not saying, human beings are, we're all fantastic, but human beings have a strong sense of decency. If they are, I'm not saying they're all good, but if they're provided the information, if they know what's happening, many of them will do something about it. And these 50 ships, all of them are taking a risk. Every single one of them. And the people who are cheering them on, some of them, I'm sure, are taking some sort of risk, but they're doing it in any case. And that, I think, is a very big deal.
And basically, they're putting their lives at risk.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Because the first flotilla that it happened years ago in the previous genocide against the Palestinians, I think 10 people were killed on the ship. If I'm not mistaken, your viewers could do a search right now and check. But the Israeli regime, they killed people. So there is a risk. And even if some of them, even if they all survive, when they come back, who knows if they're going to continue to be able to work at their jobs, or if their companies may, kick them out, or tell them not to come back to work anymore. A lot of people are taking some sort of risk, or they face challenges, but despite that, they're taking a stand. So everyone who's involved with these 50 ships, both those who are on the ships and those who are supporting them, and those who are from afar, who can't participate but their hearts are with them, that's an act of heroism. Once, I don't remember who it was. I was on a show and someone read a comment underneath and said to me that some woman from she made a comment and said, "I'm ashamed that my country is doing this," and I said that she shouldn't be ashamed if she's taking a stance against what's wrong. There's nothing for her to be ashamed of. Everyone who's doing the right thing, they have nothing to be ashamed of. If their government is doing something evil, they're not doing evil. They're standing up against evil. So they don't have to be. The government or whoever's supporting this has to be ashamed. But those people who are doing the right thing, they should be proud of themselves.
Yeah. Yeah, I know. We'll have to see what happens from here, but I am very, very excited about the 50 ships that just departed. Professor Marandi, thank you so much for your time. Is there anything that you have coming up next?
Not really. The semester begins soon, so I have to go back to class in a couple of weeks. So the end of summer. So yeah, I don't have. I was in in China a couple of weeks ago in Tianjin before the Shanghai Cooperation Organization conference. I was invited by Chinese television to do a show there for the SCO, and it was. And it's not something that passed, but since the SCO is taking place right now in Tianjin, I thought it's something perhaps interesting to just briefly touch upon. First of all, Sabrina, I've been to a number of big cities in China over the years, and they're all far more advanced than any city that I've seen in Europe or North America. Whether it's Tianjin, whether it's Beijing, whether it's Shanghai or Guangzhou or Shenzhen or Chongqing or Chengdu or the cities that I've been to, Ningbo, they're extremely advanced. And while the West is waging endless wars and slaughtering people and destroying their image across the world and creating poverty for their own people through these endless wars, the Chinese are developing their economy, and now you see I think roughly 30 heads of state in China will be taking part in also after the SCO conference in the military parade. I think it's the day after tomorrow. This is where the world is moving. And the United States under Trump, Biden, Obama, Clinton, Bush, and the Europeans, of course, they've been dragging their countries down, the crimes aside, whereas China and others are advancing. And I think this is something that I find extraordinary, that and the Western media, even now, as we speak, they're trying to sort of suppress this news, a lot of them at least, on what's going on in China, instead of rethinking their policies. Why do people across the world hate us now? Why is the standard of living going downhill? 45 years ago, the United States was the China that we see today. The United States was the country where factory workers could have a home and send their kids to college, and they had the best bridges and the best tunnels and the Lincoln Tunnel and all that. There was the new technology, and all that now is just it's all breaking down, and the country is deteriorating, and they continue the wars and the genocide. It's amazing. But that's not the future. The future for me is in a couple of weeks I go back to class. Nothing really exciting.
All right. Professor Marandi, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Sabrina. Always a pleasure.
Hey guys, this was a Sabby clip. If you like what you saw, hit that like button and subscribe.